For nearly 30 years, I have returned to the famous Sleeping Prophet, Edward Cayce's readings, as a roadmap to try and piece together the complex origins of civilization and the creation of Homo sapiens. Cayce, March the 18th, 1877 to January the 3rd, 1945, was an American Christian mystic born in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, who answered questions on subjects as varied as healing, reincarnation, wars, Atlantis, and future events while in a trance state. While only possessing an 8th grade education, not him, but almost, Cayce would ultimately transmit not just a stunning volume of material, over 14,000 readings and some 25 million words, but also a remarkable detailed and complex body of work. A non-profit organization, the Association for Research on Enlightenment, was founded to facilitate the study of Cayce's work. I have conducted a lengthy comparative analysis of the Cayce material. The literature of Rudolf Steiner, the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, the Theosophists, Plato, as well as worldwide indigenous oral traditions, myths and legends. What came forth was as unexpected as it was bizarre. Virtually all the sources claim that Homo sapiens were created in supernatural fashion long ago on the lost continent of Atlantis, which once existed in the Atlantic Ocean. A continent that had as part of its population giants and little people. Long-lived androgynous creator gods, sometimes described as possessing 6 fingers or toes, are claimed to have birthed humanity. Atlantis was claimed to have been eventually destroyed by a great flood roughly 12,000 years ago, and survivors were said to have brought the arts of civilization to Egypt and the Americas and several other locations in its aftermath. Cayce reveals the following in reading 364 to 11. Please give a few details regarding the physiognomy, habits and customs of the people of Atlantis during the period just before the first destruction. These took on many sizes as to the stature, from that as many as may be called the midget to the giants. For there were giants in the earth in those days. Men as tall as, what would be termed today, 10 to 12 feet in stature, and well proportioned throughout. Rudolf Steiner also had the following to say regarding these inhabitants of Atlantis. Everything that refers to giants and legends is absolutely based on knowledge of the truth. We feel it to be absolutely correct from the spiritual scientific point of view that the giants are stupid and the dwarfs very clever. Secret society literature, oral traditions, and religious documents like the Bible all proclaim the existence of ancient giants as well. As intriguing as all this was, however, my investigative mind kept drawing me back to the mystery of androgynous creator gods, the first beings who were considered the architects of humanity, who inhabited genderless androgynous forms back in the deep antiquity. Let's turn to Edward Cayce's scholar, W. H. Church, to help us understand what is meant by this. In what we may term its primitive or pre-Atlantean phase before the emergence of its first mighty rulers in the days of Poseidon and Atlas, or the enlightened reign of Anomalies, at what was to become the all-time zenith of Atlantean civilization, the new continent was being busily colonized. Already, it promised to become what Cayce would call the Eden of the world, and home to a most unusual race of androgynous soul beings. In Hindu mythology, the seed of our present human race were the sons of God, who during the root race associated with the Atlantean epoch had evolved into semi-divine androgynous beings, self-imprisoned in bodies that physiologically changed, becoming human in appearance. In this form, They began taking unto themselves wives, who were indeed fully human in appearance and fair to gaze upon. This description is very reminiscent of the biblical story of the Nephilim, who took on human wives. Indeed, the Bible clearly speaks of giants, 6 fingers and toes, androgynous creator gods, and a great flood. Church continues. In the early days of Emilius's rule, the separation of the genders had not yet begun to take place. Though male in their outward aspect, the androgynous sons of God embodied within themselves the nature of both male and female in one person. By turning to creative forces, they could become channels to bring into erogenous progeny after their own kind, imbued with a capacity for both genders and a double soul. In this way, common rules of procreation was unnecessary as means of propagation. While life without copulation doesn't seem like much fun, it points to a supernatural origin for humanity. An idea shared by many ancient cultures worldwide. The miraculous birth theme, or humans being made from clay or the potter's wheel, recurs throughout world religions and mythologies. Examples are to be found in Genesis, the Quran, the Egyptian, Greek, Sumerian, Incan, Chinese, and some Native American mythologies. Many of these creators are described as androgynous, like the Egyptian god Num. Num is depicted on a relief at Esna, creating humans on a potter's wheel, while the androgynous Thoth writes the years the humans will live behind him. Interestingly, the temple of Esna was dedicated to an anonymous androgynous creator god. The androgynous Num is depicted with 6 fingers. Several professionals have been exploring this strange case as well. In the Israel Exploration Journal, Volume 57 in 2007, Eretz Ziffer explores the idea of androgynous creator deities in his thought-provoking paper, The First Adam, Androgyny, and the Angazel, 2-headed busts. Angazel is an ancient site in Jordan dating to roughly 8,250 BC, where some of the world's most ancient statues were unearthed several decades ago. Ziffer makes a case that the 2-headed statues represent androgynous creator deities. Another curious twist is that the statues have 6 fingers and toes, famously associated with the biblical giant of Gath. Zephyr explains, Shmant Besserat proposed that the Angazel statues represented deities. She accounted for the polydactylism, a rare genetic syndrome, of the statues as a divine attribute, and, based on cuneiform literature, identifies the 2-headed busts as the likes of the gods Marduk, according to the Epic of Creation. 4 were his eyes, 4 were his ears. Daly, 1991, 236. And Ishtar of Nineveh, is the Tiamat she has, 4 eyes and 4 ears. Livingston, 1986, 223. Shmandat Besserat, 1998, 10-15. The 4 eyes and 4 ears may stand for a doubled face. Barnett Hu, 1986, 116, 1986-87, and 1990, explained that the polydactylism of the Angazel statues as a mark of supernatural entities, such as the biblical Rephaim, a race of giants. There was a giant of a man who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. He too was a descendant of the Repha, a single form of the Rephaim. When he taunted Israel, Jonathan, the son of David's brother Shimei, killed him. 2 Sam 21, 20-21. Thus, the prototype androgynous human containing both sexes was defined throughout the 2-headed person, claims Ziffer. What we have here is quite stunning. Some of the oldest statues ever discovered represent a worship cult of deities who were androgynous and possessed 6 fingers and toes. Remember, The statues of Angezel are over 8,000 years older than the Bible. Myths and legends whisper of times when dragons flew in the skies and giants roamed the lands. Is it possible that these creatures could have actually existed in some form or another? These stories, of course, would lend support to parents frightening the lives out of their children in order for them not to stray into the woods and fall victims to the dangers that lurked in the darker portions of our reality. Surprisingly, though, not everything is pure myth. Take giants, for instance. We would quickly associate the tales of giant beings walking amongst us as being myth. But there are accounts of taller beings within the vaults of our ancient past. Within ancient writings of the Americas, Europe, and Asia, they make mention of giants. But a handful of ancient texts go further than mentioning giants, but claim that they were real. Proof, however, for such giants is fleeting and hard to locate, and many accounts are hidden for years and sometimes decades. Some have claimed that the proof can be found in the footprint of God in South Africa. Researchers have suggested this print belonged to a being of great height, and it was claimed within different reports of archaeologists and explorers that this footprint is proof positive for the existence of giants. Michael Tellinger in 2012 produced what appeared to be a 1.2 meter long footprint. According to Michael, this was produced by a true giant on a granite rock near Umplazi on the Swaziland border to the northeast of South Africa. He went on to say this was one of the most reliable pieces of evidence that there were giants on Earth. He said, "I would like to share with you what could be one of the best pieces of evidence that prove that once, long ago, there were giants on our planet." Geologists have marveled at this gigantic footprint, 120 centimeters long, engraved in granite. This is an extremely sacred, mystical, and spiritual place for those who preserve African knowledge, and so it must remain. It is known as the footprint of God. This place presents us with a real dilemma and a great mystery that needs to be solved. Approximate calculations would suggest the footprint belonged to a person of 7.5 meters high, which would have towered over an ordinarily sized man. Suggestions put forward would claim the footprint is nothing more than a simple pattern of natural erosion, but the latest research would claim that it is unlikely the case for various reasons. Professor Peter Wagner of the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University in Port Elizabeth, South Africa, says, "There are many more possibilities that extraterrestrial beings would have created the footprint, that it would have been created by natural erosion." The large footprint is estimated to have been formed between 200 million and 300 million years ago, in accordance, it has been suggested, with our current understanding of granite formation. However, not everyone is convinced, and heated arguments are still ongoing between experts. Originally discovered in 1912 by Stoffel Gotze, a farmer of the local area, whilst hunting, the footprint was presented to the public in 2012 on world television and internet channels. The area is rich in wildlife, including antelopes, wildebeest, and lions, and the footprint remains in the same state in which it was discovered in 1912. Because of its remote location, Tellinger believes it reduces the possibility that it has been sculpted by someone, stating, "The footprint has not deteriorated too much since the time it was discovered. The possibility that this footprint is a hoax is very small due to its remote location. The pattern that presents erosion within the footprint is very similar to the pattern we find around it. It is hard to imagine that someone, thousands of years ago, decided to sculpt a giant footprint on a stone, precisely in this place so isolated that even today it is difficult to find. Some would suggest it is unimaginable that thousands of years ago a hoaxer decided to carve a giant footprint in granite at this remote point in the landscape. Even today it's difficult to find. Why would someone choose this remote location? It makes no sense. And back then, who would even have contemplated the implications the hoax would have had on the scientific community or general public? If it's a hoax, then we are faced with an extravagant hoax carried out by the best hoaxers ever known. Geologically speaking, the area and the rock that contains the footprint can be described as thick porphyrite granite, which underwent multiple stages of cooling. This resulted in a fascinating mixture of large and small grains, which give rise to a high quality when polished. In the geology of South Africa, the rock has been officially dated to be around 3.1 billion years old. Michael believes the erosion pattern inside and outside the footprint are identical. This would suggest it really was created by the foot of a giant. However, for the giant to have formed his foot in stone, it would have to have been made in a molten state. And giant or not, we can assume he would have had enough intelligence not to put his foot into a molten pool of rock. However, if it was formed through natural erosion thousands of years ago, did the outline encourage a group of Stone Age men to use their primitive tools to enhance it? Why would anyone carve such a footprint? If it were indeed some type of Stone Age hoax, then why are there no chisel marks seen in the rock? Austrian researcher Klaus Donner visited the track along with Michael Tellinger in January 2012. He suggests the footprint is spectacular and points out that the print was not made artificially. He proposed a link between the origins of the footprint and bones found in Ecuador that belonged to giants of the same height, 7.5 meters. In April 2005, David Icke and a famous African shaman, Credo Mutwa, visited the giant footprint. Mutwa claimed that the footprint was the most sacred place in South Africa and suggested it belonged to the left foot of a woman, and the right foot of the woman was formed on another stone in Sri Lanka, which has never been located. The mystery as to how the incredible print was created will remain so until science is able to grasp another form of testing rock. For now, we are left with theories, traditions, and myths to explain it. Others believe this print to be recorded evidence of the existence of the giant sons of God, the Nephilim, mentioned in the Bible and in other writings. However, the Christian scribes mistranslated Nephilim as meaning giants, when its true meaning were those that came down. Other so-called experts believe that they are the sons of Seth, angels, or some bizarre hybrid offspring that could have been eliminated in the Great Universal Flood. This type of rock, however, is not sedimentary. It's igneous. It was created from magma deep in the earth and crystallizes on cooling. According to those who argue against the print being that of a giant, suggest in order for the footprint to have formed, it would have to have been made in warm magma. Most of this leads us to rule out the possibility that its cause was due to a footprint of a giant. But then what is it? When the granite reaches the surface, sometimes it erodes, forming peculiar cavities as seen in the rocks of Kangaroo Island in Australia or the Bear Rock in Sardinia. These cavities are shared characteristics of granite weathering. The cavities in the rock originate from a physical process in which water drags dissolved minerals to the surface of the rock. When the water dries, the dissolved minerals form crystals, wedging in the small fissures and flecking the stone. These cavities are known as taphonae and occurs especially in granite near the sea. Not only that, but the footprint is in a vertical granite outcrop, which, in order to have acquired that position, would have to have been pushed to the surface by tectonic pressures. However, the rocky mass of granite on which the print appears has no indication of being displaced upwards. Whatever the reason for the print, the arguments continue and are hotly debated. Not until the rocks are thoroughly examined will the truth finally break free. The aspect of super-taller beings will for now remain in the annals of myth and folklore, and until we are presented with definitive proof of their existence, will remain to haunt our dreams, and not our reality. Holder have already been examined at the Smithsonian Institute by Dr. Alice Hardlinka, foremost authority on the North American types. Currently, there are a slew of books, DVDs, and even at least one TV show documenting the exploits of modern hunters who are on the trail of the anomalous dead, who insist that if at least one of these skeletons can be found and presented to the experts, it would somehow alter the professed paradigm of the establishment itself. However, as we will continue to demonstrate, the experts have already rediscovered, photographed, and measured these types of remains. Following our overview of discoveries of gigantic humanoid skeletons in the burial mounds and associated graveyards of the Adena Hope Whale, archaic cultures, and southeastern ceremonial complex, we will now document the discovery of the unique physical types, or UPT, even after the institution of the mainstream policy of denial or post-cover-up. The two preeminent Adena scholars of the 20th century were William S. Webb, assisted by Charles Snow of the University of Kentucky, and Don Draco of the Carnegie Museum. When Webb excavated the Dover Mound in Mason County, Kentucky, he encountered a group burial of 4 skeletons, one of which represented the unique physical type. The remains of Burial 40 is one of the largest known to Adena. The skull foot measurement is 84 inches, or 7 feet. The burial census table mentions that the skeleton had a very thick skull and represented the tallest Adena male from the mound. For other burials in the Dover Mound, the table includes such details as prominent bilateral chin, rugged head and face, wide bilateral chin, high vaulted, large-faced. The Dover Mound also yielded skeletons with dental abnormalities. Burial 54 included a supernumerary tooth with twin cusps lying diagonally in the left maxilla, as well as shovel-shaped later incisors. Recently recorded instances of Adena supernumerary teeth occur at McMurray Mound 1 and Sydnor Mound 1 in Ohio. One particular monstrous deformation analysed and photographed in the Ohio archaeologist may be an extreme case of the type of dental anomalies found in the Dover Mound. Webb and Snow also noted the large crania of the Adena, which they partly attributed to headboarding. Not only do the Dover people show the results of head-shaping deformation, but they exceed the total Kentucky series in the great width and height of a skull vault. It is to be noted that the head-shaping has been extreme in these cases. These people, as a group, have the highest skull vaults reported anywhere in the world. Another feature of the UPTs documented by Webb and Snow is the massive lower jaw. One of the outstanding and un-Indian traits present among the Adena people is their prominent and often bilateral chins. One of the skulls from the Dover Mound Burial 25 represents a bilateral chin with a width of 52 millimeters. One of the particular features present in at least 1.5 of the observed examples is the great width of the bony chin. Formed by bilateral eminence is rarely found among the skulls of the much earlier shell-heap people or among the later Hopewell people. Besides the large skeletal type, Snow noted the discovery of the dwarf type, mentioned in early literature in his observations of the famous Adena pipe from Ross County, Ohio. Further evidence of abnormal Adena individuals is portrayed in a remarkable piece of sculpture in the round, the Adena pipe figurine, depicted as typical of this form of dwarfism. The text references the excavation of one of the individuals at Waverly, Ohio. The following description of this burial is from Gerald Folk. A skeleton of peculiar form. It was not over 5 feet long, but the bones were very thick, and the processes for attachment of muscles were extraordinary in their development. The skull was nearly half an inch thick, and of unusual size, mostly back of the ears, though the forehead was full and high. The teeth were large, hard, and but little worn. In 1958, Don Draco encountered the large Adena type while excavating the Cressup Mound in West Virginia on behalf of the Carnegie Museum. In a subfloor tomb, he unearthed Burial 54. This individual was of large proportions. When measured in the tomb, his length was approximately 7 foot 4 inches. All of the bones were heavy and possessed marked eminences for the attachment of muscles. This discovery, as well as the review of Webb's earlier work at the Dover Mound, influenced Draco's remarkable observations of Adena anthropology. Two outstanding traits have been noted repeatedly for this group. One is the protruding and massive chin, often with prominent bilateral protrusions. The second trait is the large size of many of the males and some of the females. A male of 6 feet was common, and some individuals approaching 7 feet in height have been found, for example, burial 40 in the Dover Mound and burial 54 in the Cressup Mound. Some of the females in the Dover Mound also were more than 6 feet in height. Not only were these Adena people tall, but also the massiveness of the bones indicates powerfully built individuals. The head was generally big, with a large cranial capacity. To Webb, Snow and Draco, the evidence clearly pointed towards the existence of a group of genetically related elites within the Adena sphere who shared the UPT traits. The true number of these individuals have been obfuscated by the common practice of cremation. If, as the evidence seems to indicate, the burials in the tombs were those of a selected group, such factors would have undoubtedly been of importance, not only in the development of the prominent chin, but also in the large stature. If only certain inbreeding individuals of the total population were members of a selected group, genetic factors would also have played an important part in the establishment of the unique Adena physical type. How widespread throughout the entire Adena population were the unique traits of the tomb burials is unknown, but Snow's study of the cremated remains from the Dover Mound indicate that at least some of the individuals among these cremated remains also possessed the unique traits of the flesh burials in the tombs. Because of the common practice of cremating most of the dead, we will probably never be able to determine the full extent of these special traits in the general population. The emerging picture of this elite race within late, archaic, early woodland societies who were often buried in the mounds and who represented a type of royalty. Among these interrelated groups were UPTs. This elitism is further evidenced by the presence of extensive child and infant burials in the tombs, often accompanied by some exotic goods, as the adults including shell beads and copper rings. Also, dental and bone anomalies have been used to establish a genetic connection between individuals at mound sites. Gigantic discoveries are often challenged with the generic statement that average Adena were between 5'6" and 5'11" feet tall, but this argument is a conjecture of half-truth disguised as science. We are not concerned with the average stature of the Adena populace, but rather the irregular characteristics and often abnormally tall stature of their elite. Besides the professional literature, so-called amateur archaeologists have also chronicled conclusive evidence of unique physical types, with a great consistency of the discoveries of Draco and Webb. In 1908, Lewis Wallace Murray recorded that at Toga Point in Pennsylvania, remains of a skeleton of a man 6 or more feet in height beneath a cyst-like grave were found. The grave itself was encased and moved to the local museum, where the bones were studied by hundreds of people. Other skeletons from the same area were of unusual size, one judged from the length of the thigh bone to be 7 feet. In addition to these, Murray documents the examination of a large skeleton by Professor Holbrook. Judging by the thigh bone, he must have been 7 feet tall. The skull was much larger than usual, very thick, the forehead unusually receded, the top flattened. The jaws were extremely strong, full of large, perfect teeth. Following the discovery of burials in her own flower garden, Murray embarked on an archaeological odyssey of her own. In 1921, she published an article for the American Anthropologist noting that the femur, jaw, and teeth of one of the 7-foot skeletons was then still in the Toga Point Museum. Also included are references to many skeletons between 6 and 7 feet tall, with photographs of artifacts, pottery, and in situ burial of one of the above 6 feet burials. The article also features a photograph of the Paul Scott collection, described as the multiplicity of small artifacts, suggesting a race of pygmies, which included a miniature amulet and sinker stones. Regardless of the disparagement of amateurs, historians and antiquarians, the credentials of Webb, Snow and Draco have never been brought into question. With so many researchers scrambling today to discover irrefutable evidence of gigantic or otherwise anomalous beings to prove their existence, the authors question, why do they not simply present the works of William S. Webb and Don Draco to anthropologists, and more importantly, their audiences? While the concept of a mysterious and undiscovered race may create an air of sensationalism healthy for selling books and DVDs, we feel it is of far more relevance to demonstrate that the unique physical types were discovered by professionals all the way up through the 20th century, even after the institutionalized policy of denial, and yet the establishment continues to deny their own documented evidence and the truth. In the 1800s, reports began to surface of the discovery of very large skeletal remains in the burial mounds of North America. These skeletons were described as reaching 7 feet or 8 feet or 2.4 meters in length, with a lower frequency of discoveries spanning 9 to 11 feet, 3.3 meters in length, and having very large skulls and gigantic lower jaw bones. Historians often detail these remains in early local historical records, such as the following from Case County, Michigan. It was a mound about 13 feet high. The diameter of its base was about 50 feet. Portions of the skeletons were in good state of preservation. The femur or thigh bone, one of the males, which Dr. Bonnier has now in his possession, is of great size and indicates that its owner must have been at least 7 feet in height. Antiquarians also wrote about the anthropology of the tall ones in prehistoric mounds. A recent exploration of a mound near this place resulted in some interesting discoveries. The form was large, the jaws massive, and the teeth perfect. As is well known, 19th and early 20th century newspapers frequently ran stories of gigantic skeletons found throughout the county. The following report is from Portsmouth, Ohio. Bridge carpenters of the NWRR found a gigantic skeleton while excavating 3 miles east of Portsmouth a few days ago. The skeleton measured 7 foot 4 inches. In the 1880s, the Eastern Mound Division of the Smithsonian discovered a number of gigantic skeletons in their wanton destruction of North American tumuli. The 12th annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology documents numerous gigantic skeletons found by the Smithsonian agents. Near the original surface of the mound, lying at full length upon its back, was one of the largest skeletons discovered by the Bureau agents, the length, as proved by actual measurement, being between 7 and 8 feet. In the centre of Mound 11, 3 feet below the surface, was a vault, 8 foot long and 3 foot wide. In the bottom of this lay a skeleton, fully 7 feet long. The length from the base of the skull to the bones of the toes was found to be 7 foot 3 inches. It is probable, therefore, that this individual, when living, was 7 foot 5 high. The 20th century saw the rediscovery of the ancient giants by mainstream archaeologists. Working with Charles Snow, William S. Webb of the University of Kentucky positively identified the unique skeletal features noted by the early sources with the people of the Adena Mound building culture. Webb and Snow's analysis of the anthropology of Adena was described in the Adena People, No. 1, published in 1945, and No. 2, co-written with Raymond S. Beebe in 1957. The forehead is typical, a prominent one, bordered below by fairly prominent brow ridges. The characteristic bulge of the upper and lower jaws is moderate in projection. Usually the cheekbones are not only large size in themselves, but they have a forward and lateral prominence. In addition to these strong features, Webb, Snow and Beebe in 1957 remarked upon the great width of the bony chin formed by lateral eminences. The typical Adena crania were extremely high vaulted. Approximately 89% of the adult males and 92% of the females are brachycephalic. In the report on the Dover Mound in Kentucky, Webb and Snow noted that the Adena crania represented the highest skull vaults reported anywhere in the world. Webb and Snow, the Dover Mound in 1959, cephalic indices measured for Adena range from 89 to 100. The Adena people practiced artificial flattening of the occipital region, which added height to the cranial vault. This practice merely enhanced congenial features. Those skulls with slight or no deformation, undeformed, present similar proportions. It is likely that many, if not most, of the skull's characteristics so typical of Adena are of genetic nature. At the Dover Mound, Webb encountered a 7-foot, 2 meters tall skeleton with these notable Adena features. The remains of Burial 40 is one of the largest known to Adena. The skull-foot field measurement is 84 inches or 7 feet. In 1958, Don Draco of the Carnegie Museum uncovered the remains of an individual of large proportions in a subsurface tomb at the lowest strata of the Crescent Mound in West Virginia. When measured in the tomb, his length was approximately 7'4". All of the long bones were heavy and possessed marked eminences for their attachment of muscles. Draco described the unique traits of Adena, including the protruding and massive chin with prominent bilateral protrusions, as well as individuals approaching 7 feet in height. It is important to note that in considering this information from Webb, Snow, and Draco, regularly occurring gigantic members are not the only unique features of the Adena people. Not only were these Adena people tall, but also the massiveness of the bones indicates probably powerfully built individuals. The head was generally big, with a large cranial capacity. Working in the 20th century, Webb, Snow, and Draco essentially corroborated the findings of antiquarians and linked the gigantic skeletal types with a specific culture. Following this, the pioneering research of Ross Hamilton and the late Vine Delora set the scholarly standard for giantology, synchronizing the native and archaeological records in Hamilton's unsurpassed work, A Tradition of Giants. And yet, in spite of this tradition of rediscovery, no satisfactory reconstruction of an Adena giant has ever been undertaken. While we are routinely reminded of the dimensions of the giants in volumes reprinting multiple hundreds of accounts of their discovery, we have been denied imagery representing their living form. While numerous anomalies, such as the Paracas and Starchild crania, have received due attention, the gigantic Adena have remained shrouded in mystery. In May of 2015, the authors undertook a joint venture with the legendary Marcia K. Moore to remedy the situation. Marcia is best known as the premier artist recreating the living images of the elongated crania of Peru associated with the Paracas people. Her work has appeared in the books of Brian Forrester and L.M. Marzulli, and has featured on the Ancient Aliens TV series, with Marcia herself occasionally appearing on the show Ancient Aliens: Alien Evolution. The skull used for the Adena recreation was that of Burial 16 from the Wright Mounds in Kentucky, where it is described as showing pronounced deformation. In skeletal material from the Wright site, Montgomery County, Kentucky in 1940, H.T.E. Hertzberg noted that the crania of the Wright site featured the large prognathic lower mandibles or protruding lower jaw, typical of Adena, and although artificially deformed, the series demonstrated the large congenial features detailed by Webb, Snow, and Draco. Deformed as they are, these crania display a pronounced brachiocephalic. It may be noticed that 4 skulls displaying submedium deformation also give an average cranial index of over 90%. Thus, the inference is that these people would have shown pronounced brachiocephalic even without deformation. The dimensions of the Adena giant were derived from several sources with corroborating details. Among these, the authors referenced the handwritten field notebook of P. W. Norris, the agent of the Bureau of Ethnology, who excavated the Adena mounds in Charleston, West Virginia in 1883 and 1884, noted in the Smithsonian manuscript Norris Mound Excavations. Several mounds at Charleston yielded skeletons 7 foot or 2 meters long. At the Great Smithsonian Mound, Norris encountered a house-like timber structure 12 feet by 13 feet broad, or 3.6 by 4 meters, and 6 feet or 1.8 meters high, reaching 10 feet or 3 meters at the ridge top. Within this structure was a gigantic and prominent personage, surrounded by 5 of his probably volunteer warriors. Norris measured the central burial in situ and described it as a gigantic human skeleton 7 foot 6 inches in length and 19 inches between the shoulders. Elsewhere in the manuscript, the skeleton is regularly referred to as the giant or gigantic. Significantly, this particular burial was wrapped in bark and covered in a dry clay. This certainly suggests that the in-situ measurements would have been accurate, rather than the product of some type of disarticulation due to the weight of the mound mass, as mainstream sources often claim. The measurements provided by Norris are similar to those from several other sources, including the accounts of the gigantic specimen unearthed by Warren K. Moorhead in Ohio, documented in his Primitive Man of Ohio, written in 1892. 6 feet above the remains was found the partial skeleton of a man almost a giant in size. The breadth across the shoulders, with the bones correctly placed, was 19 inches. The anthropological details of Edina recorded by Webb, Snow and Draco, and the early historians, antiquarians, corroborate Norris's account and indicate individuals approaching 8 feet or 2.4 meters tall. Since a high frequency of reports describe skeletons reaching this height, the data was used by Marcia to formulate the likely dimensions and appearance of an 8-foot-tall Edina in the flesh. Marcia has done more than merely provide a visual for a tall member of the prehistoric population. The Edina giant represents a truly unique form of humankind, which until now has only been suggested by the multitude of newspaper and historical accounts regularly reprinted in the Giantology marketplace. The recreation of a very large member of Webb, Snow and Draco's unique group of honoured dead provides a glimpse into the distant past, a snapshot from beyond the veil pulled over history by the establishment a century ago. Marcia is currently working with authors on a book to be published in 2016 that will feature an extensive set of her recreations of Edina and Edina-like individuals from the burial mounds of North America and around the world. This important visual work will accompany the presentation of 7,000 years of obfuscated world history.
The Bible contains many stories of races of giants which once existed on Earth. Giants also appear in one form or another in the folklore, myths and legends of most countries. Additionally, there are recent cases of the actual remains of giants being discovered, like the Cardiff Giant of New York, and the bones of 8-foot-tall prehistoric beings discovered in West Virginia, which suggest to some that a race of giants may once have roamed the earth. Giants in myth and on Earth. In ancient myths, giants are often seen as ancestors to the gods, but also their unrelenting enemies who are ultimately defeated by them. The folklore of ancient places has many associations with supernatural creatures who may once have been worshipped as gods. Ancient tombs and stone circles are often said to be inhabited by fairies, built by giants or the devil, haunted by ghosts, guarded by dragons, visited by spectral black dogs, or cursed by witches. Although scientists believe these giants of myth and legend to grow to 20 feet or more have no basis in reality, 1 or 2 researchers believe that a race of giants may once have existed on Earth. According to science, some extraordinary exceptions amongst Homo sapiens have existed. They are usually the result of hormonal disorders, and there is no evidence that hominins ever got taller than we are today. The tallest person ever measured was Robert Wadlow, also known as the Alton Giant and the Giant of Illinois, who stood 8 feet 11 inches tall. Wadlow died at the age of just 22 in 1940. An early death is common for those suffering from giantism, as their weight and size puts constant strain on the heart and skeletal system. Giants in America. Apparent evidence of giants in America has a long history. The Massachusetts Puritan minister Cotton Mather believed that mastodon fossils found near Albany, New York in 1705 were those of giants who had died in Noah's flood. He wrote, "The giants that once groaned under the waters are now under the earth, and their dead bones are lively proofs of the Mosaic history." Almost 100 years later, Connecticut farmer Pliny Moody discovered large 3-toed tracks in a sandstone ridge on his land. The local pastor told him they were made by Noah's raven, which had rested on that ledge and probably slept there before resuming the dangerous journey back to the ark. The same ministers later reasoned that dinosaur bones found locally were probably the remains of giant humans. During the period from the late 1800s all the way up to the 1990s, there were over 1,000 reports of giant-sized human skeleton remains being discovered across North America. Old reports were discovered, particularly from New England, of giant skeletons being unearthed from Native American burial mounds, which supposedly ranged in length from 7 to 10 feet tall. But the most famous of all American giants is the Cardiff Giant. The discovery of the Cardiff Giant. On the 16th of October 1869, two labourers, Gideon Emmons and Henry Nichols, were digging a well behind the barn of William C. Newell in Cardiff, New York, when they hit a solid object 3 feet down. After further digging and clearing away the soil, the pair unearthed a 10-foot-tall petrified man. News of the extraordinary discovery soon spread, and people came from far and wide to see the giant, which was displayed under a tent set up by landowner Newell, who charged 50 cents for admission. During the first week alone, around 2,500 people came to visit the strange exhibition. The area around Cardiff was known for its fossil deposits, so initially it was thought that the giant could have been an ancient ancestor of the local Onondaga people, who had perhaps been petrified by the waters of a nearby swamp. Whatever it was, the Cardiff Giant caused wonder and excitement in all who saw it. Scholar Michael Petit writes, "Many spectators understood the giant within the framework of wonder, in which extraordinary objects that seemed to transcend the laws of nature were valued and deemed authentic for precisely that reason. Across the social spectrum, from farmers who paid 50 cents to view the statue where it lay, to the transcendentalist philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, who viewed the giant at an exhibition in Boston, expressions of wonder were heard. Even the experts were impressed by the discovery, though most believed it was an ancient statue rather than a petrified man. New York State geologist James Hall and Rochester University professor Henry Ward believed this to be the case, with Hall describing it as the most remarkable object yet brought to light in our country. Soon afterwards, Newell thought it best to cash in on all the publicity and sold a 3/4 stake in the giant to a syndicate of businessmen led by a David Hannum, receiving a payment of $23,000, about $500,000 in today's money. On the 5th of November 1869, the syndicate had the giant dug up and shipped to Syracuse. The pair then took the giant on the road and exhibited it to thousands of paying spectators in Syracuse and Albany. But all this added publicity brought some unwanted attention for the owners. A mining engineer who saw the giant close up remarked that the gypsum it appeared to be made from would have deteriorated quickly in the wet soil of Newell's farm. Even worse was to follow when on the 25th of November, well-known Yale paleontologist Othniel Charles Marsh saw the giant and immediately pronounced it of very recent origin and a most decided humbug. I'm surprised that any scientific observers should not have at least once detected the unmistakable evidence against its antiquity. Despite this, the giant soon came to the attention of the American showman P.T. Barnum, who did not appear at all bothered by the doubts about its origin and offered to buy it from them for a huge sum. In his 1890 book, Funny Stories, he remarked, "One thing was certain, it was a great attraction, visited by hundreds of people daily, and I thought that it's so great a curiosity it should be exhibited under proper management in New York City. I therefore approached the proprietors, and I said I will give you $50,000 for your Cardiff Giant as it is." But the syndicate declined the offer, so Barnum decided to make an exact copy of the giant and arrange for its copy to be exhibited at a museum in New York. According to Barnum, it was a considerable attraction and drew crowds of visitors, while the original was lumbering away along the North Hudson River, stopping at towns on the way. The syndicate tried to bring an injunction against Barnum, but the judge told them, "Bring your giant here, and if he swears to his own genuineness as a bona fide petrifaction, you shall have the injunction you ask for." Unable to do this, the businessmen were at a loss what to do, but their problem was soon solved by a shocking revelation. The real origins of the giant. On the 10th of December, George Hull, a businessman from Binghamton, New York, confessed to the press that he had created the Cardiff Giant. On February 2, 1870, the Chicago Tribune published an expose on the Cardiff Giant that included confessions from the masons who had worked on it. But it wasn't a hoax perpetrated just for fun, as many were in the late 19th century North America. Hull, an atheist, worked as a tobacconist in Binghamton, New York in 1867. He visited Ackley, Iowa for business, and while there had an extended discussion with a traveling Methodist revivalist preacher called Reverend Turk. The pair argued over the biblical passage from Genesis, which states there were giants in the earth in those days. The preacher insisted that everything in the Bible, including that phrase, should be taken literally. Hull disagreed vehemently, but Ackley's extreme opinion provided him with the inspiration he needed for his hoax. It took Hull over 2.5 years and cost him around $2,600 to make the Cardiff Giant from a 5-ton, 4.5 metric tons, block of gypsum he had quarried in Fort Dodge, Iowa. Hull searched far and wide for the right burial location for the giant, eventually settling on Cardiff, New York, about 60 miles from Hull's home in Binghamton. Hull's cousin was none other than William Newell, and it was his farm that Hull used for the burial spot. It was Hull and Newell who had hired the 2 workers to dig a well at the farm, instructing them exactly where to dig. The Cardiff hoax seemed to have worked so well as people wanted it to be real. Many at the time believed it to be genuine, partly because its existence appeared to confirm the literal truth of biblical statements about giants roaming the earth. Ken Feder, author of the 2001 book Frauds, Myths and Mysteries, believes this to be the case, though he thinks other factors were at work. He said, "The most obvious explanation is that the Cardiff Giant confirmed biblical stories of giants. Then there were folks who probably knew better, the smart businessman in Syracuse. They saw that people were coming in to see the giant, using hotel space, and buying food."
One of the most controversial subjects regarding the ancient prehistoric cultures of North America concerns what we refer to as the unique physical types, or UPT. For the purposes of what follows, these UPT are often gigantic humanoid skeletons with upper elongated or high-vaulted crania, occasional extra or pathological detentions, including several reports of double or triple rows of teeth, and are usually discovered in the burial mounds and associated graveyards of the Adena Hopewell, archaic cultures, and southeastern ceremonial complex. It is common today for alternative history researchers to tell the story of how these beings were discovered en masse throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Historians, antiquarians, and archaeologists recorded the discovery of the unique physical types all over the United States, with a large concentration found in the mounds and earthworks of the Ohio River Valley and along the Mississippi River. These accounts can be found in any number of county, township, and state histories, as well as anthropological literature from both inside and outside of the Smithsonian Institution. Here are several examples. From a mound on the farm of Eden Burrows near Franklin were exhumed in May 1841, at a depth of 12 feet, several human skeletons. One of extraordinary dimensions was found between what appeared to have been 2 logs covered with a wooden slab. Many of the bones were entire. The underjaw was large enough to fit over the jaw, flesh, and all of any common man in the present day. The thigh bones were full 6 inches longer than those of any man in Simpson County. Teeth, arms, ribs, and all gave evidence of a giant of a former race. Recorded in the History of Kentucky, Lewis Collins. The mounds of the bluff have nearly all been opened within the last 2 or 3 years. In all that have been opened, the excavators have found in the centre a pit that was evidently dug about 2.5 feet below the original surface of the ground. The bones in this pit indicate a race of gigantic stature, buried in a sitting posture around the sides of a pit with leads extended toward the centre. Recorded in the History of Joe Davis's County. Near the original surface, 10 or 12 feet from the centre of the mound, on the lower side, lying at a full length upon its back, was one of the largest skeletons discovered by the Bureau agents. The length was proved by actual measurement between 7 and 8 feet, it was all clearly traceable. Reported in the 12th Annual Report of the Bureau of Ethnology. Number 11 is now 35 by 40 feet at the base and 4 feet high. In the centre, 3 feet below the surface, was a vault 8 feet long and 3 feet wide. In the bottom of this, among the decaying fragments of bark wrappings, lay a skeleton fully 7 feet long, extended at full length on the back, head west. 19 feet from the top, in the remains of a bark coffin, a skeleton measuring 7.5 feet in length and 19 inches across the shoulders was discovered. Reported in the 12th Annual Report of the Bureau of Ethnology. Within the village of Brownston, 10 miles from Charleston and just below the mouth of Lewis Len's Creek, is another such ancient burying ground. At Brownston, not long since, 2 skeletons were found together. One huge large frame about 7 feet in length, and the other about 4 feet, a dwarf and deformed. History of the Great Kanawha Valley. Pursuing my investigations and excavating further toward the southeast face of the mound, I came upon the largest stone axe I've ever seen, or that has ever been found in this section of the country. Close to it was the largest and most perfect cranium of the mound. Nearby this skull were the right femurs, the tibia, the humerus, and part of the radius, with a portion of the pelvis directly under the skull. Anticipating a perfect specimen in the skull, I was doomed to disappointment, for after taking it out of the earth and setting it up so that I could view the fleshless face of this gigantic savage, in the space of 2 hours it had crumbled to pieces, except for small portions. According to the measurement of the bones of the skeleton, its height must have been quite 7 feet. Reported in the Annual Report of the Boards of Regents of the Smithsonian. In the same line of abnormality was the finding of one skull in which the detention reached the unusual number of 40 teeth, the increase consisting of 8 additional incisors. The formation of the skull found in the Larto Mound, as compared with those of other localities, is highly anomalous. The anomaly in these cases cannot be ascribed to artificial disfiguration, for, were it such, the otherwise symmetrical development of the other parts would be impossible. The remarkable conformation could not possibly have been the result of bandages or other external appliances, but was undoubtedly congenital. Recorded in the publication of the Louisiana Historical Society. Within Grave A of the Etowah Mound group is a stone sepulchre, 2.5 feet wide, 8 feet long and 2 feet deep, and was formed by placing steatite slabs on edge at the sides and ends, and others across the top. The bottom consisted simply of earth hardened by fire. It contained the remains of a single skeleton lying on its back, with the head east. The frame was heavy and 7 feet long. Reported in the 12th Annual Report of the Bureau of Ethnology. These examples represent the various anomalous features of the unique physical types, which were encountered in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Spatially and culturally, they illustrate the extensive temporal and geographical range of these types. The Kanawha Valley mound builders left their remains in an area where some of the oldest Phaeacic Adena pottery and diverse types of mound construction have been found. It has recently been suggested that sites in West Virginia may push the acceptable beginning of the early woodland period back to 1400–1300 BC. The samples from Illinois came from a region where Archaic-era mounds have been found, often with Hopewell mounds built over and into them hundreds or thousands of years later, as in the case of Elizabeth Mound 1 and Peter Clunk Mound 7. The Etowah Mound, Mound C, is ascribed to the Mississippian cult, dated to 950 to 1450 AD. After the government and philanthropies took over the American archaeology in the 1900s, the establishment undertook the policy of flatly denying the existence of anomalous remains. The actual beginning point for the revisionist tendency in the National Museum was very early. By 1851, E.G. Squire was working to debunk theories of pre-Columbian contact, and several decades later, Gerald Folk would attempt to discredit and jettison the work of virtually every researcher in the field up to his day, including the skeletal measurements of his fellow agents in the Bureau of Ethnology. However, the denial of the unique types truly gets underway during the reign of Alice Hardliska as the curator of anthropology at the Smithsonian, circa 1903. Hardliska seems to have made a hobby of constantly disparaging the notion that anomalous skeletons were ever found. This was done in scholarly works as well as public venues. And the giant, an 8-foot skeleton, is to this day the most stereo-framed feature of many an amateur report of a find of skeletal remains in Florida, as well as other parts of the country. All these reports, it may be said once and for all, are exaggerations. Dr. Hardliska blames the will to believe of amateur anthropologists for many reports of discoveries which find their way to his office with monumentous frequency. The purported finds describe a race of ancient giants between 7 and 8 feet tall with bones and jaws considerably larger than those living today. Next to human giants, Dr. Hardliska reports fancy finds at sway with human dwarfs. Interestingly, Hardliska's name appears in several reports of discoveries of gigantic skeletons during his tenure at the American Museum. The skeletons of these hitherto unknown American Aborigines showed they all ranged in height from 6 1/2 to 7 feet. Excavating in the sand dunes of a sun-spread Golden Isles, Georgia, archaeologists have gouged out a strange record of an amazing prehistoric race of giants. What manner of men were these? The members of whose tribe were all averaged 6 1/2 and 7 feet tall. Some of the first skulls to be disinterred by Preston